is up, my Shadowverse soldiers, and welcome back to another Shadowverse Evolved video. Alright soldiers, so today's video we're going to be talking about the new set 11 Runecraft deck. So I'm very excited to talk about this deck because I've been trying to piece together a mage version of this Runecraft deck where you have a whole bunch of mages that have different costs, where you can play a big boss monster at the end, and so forth. I'm really going to talk more about it in this video, so you'll understand more once we get through to it. But I've been trying to cook with a version of a deck like this before we had all the key pieces that were able to put everything together. But as of set 11, I think all the new parts in set 11 are just like glued to what I've been talking about. So I'm glad that this deck is actually coming to fruition now. So I'm very excited to talk about it today. And alright soldiers, without further ado, let's go ahead and roll that intro so we can figure out what deck we are talking about today. And alright soldiers, if you didn't already know what today's video was going to be about, it's going to be about Vincent Runecraft. So the thing about Vincent Runecraft is you have to have X amount of cards in your cemetery, X being if you have this follower that has a base cost of 1 to like 12, because that's really what it goes up to for Runecraft at least. Oh, excuse me, 15, because we do have one card that is a 15 cost in Runecraft. So as long as we have those X amount of cards that have different costs into our cemetery, we're able to do lots of effects. Alright, so I didn't want to dig too deep into the deck because I feel like I would be explaining what the deck would be doing without getting into it. So let's go ahead and start talking about the pros and cons for the deck. Alright, so looking here at our first pro, so we have removal. So anything that's going to be Runecraft most of the time is going to have at least a decent amount of removal, or some way to have some removal in its deck, just because we are kind of the control-based class. So we need to make sure we control our opponent's cards. And then next up, we have big burn. So if you have that requirement of those different base costs into the cemetery, you're going to be doing lots of burn damage. So you don't have to worry about storm. You don't have to worry about having your followers stay stale for like a turn so they can swing. No, you're going to be doing stuff by burn damage in this deck. And then lastly, we have the late game. So of course, when we get to the big burn, we're going to be doing that later on in the game. And that's kind of how Runecraft is going to be working. Hey, we're prolonging the game with our removal. We're removing your cards, so we're able to have some value on our turns, so we can keep doing the same process so we can get into those bigger play points. Alright, and then moving over into the cons, so we have the banished weakness. So if we do play a follower that is one of the requirement costs that we do need into our cemetery, it is going to be pretty bad if we're playing against a class that does banish, or if they're able to banish our cards. Alright, and then next up we have hand advantage. So usually in Runecraft, most of the time we're going to be plussing in hand. So in this deck, we're actually not going to have too much of a hand advantage here, just because most of the cards that we are going to be drawing, we're going to be throwing away as well. So you're not really going to be netting any card advantage in this deck. All right, and then next up we have the hard setup. So with having different card costs into the cemetery, you have to make sure you don't get rid of a boss monster at a point in time where you might be able to play it that very next turn. So there's lots of setup that you got to think about. And mind you, when you are setting up, while you're kind of drawing and discarding while also removing, there's elements where you're just like, oh, well, I wish I didn't pitch that card because I wish I had it in my hand right now. Alrighty, and then the last con, we have survivability. So there's one thing that I'll always say about Runecraft decks is that, of course, we're going to have removal in our decks, but there's only so much removal in our deck, and then sometimes we do break. So being able to not have the removal at the right time can really be vital. So being able to survive is definitely a con for the deck. Alright, so enough of what's good and what's bad. Let's talk about our legendary that we really do need to focus on. Alright, so looking at Vincent, so he's a 5-cost 4/4. You can evolve him for 1, and you can activate only if a follower had gained attack or defense this turn. But when he comes into play, search your deck for a Wasteland card and then bury it, and then you shuffle your deck. So looking over at the evolve side, so he turns into a 5/5, but on evolve, if there are at least 3 cards with different base costs in your cemetery, you can give your leader +3 defense. And if there are at least 6 cards, you can draw a card. And if there are at least 9, you can deal 9 damage to each enemy following on the field. And if there are at least 12, you can deal 12 damage to each enemy leader. Alright, so essentially, as soon as you play Vincent, you're going to be searching for a Wasteland card that you want into your cemetery for getting the bonus of, X cards in the cemetery like we're seeing on the Evolve here. And getting into the Evolve, as long as we have those 3 different cards, which by turn 5 we should have those 3 different card costs in there, to go ahead and heal 3. And if we have 6, which might be more of a stretch on turn 5, to go ahead and draw a card. But if you have the 9, which is going to be very later in the game, being able to deal 9 damage to each enemy following the field is very vital, just to get some board wipe. And then having the at least 12, which is going to be way crazier, but that is the big ult there to go ahead and deal 12 damage to enemy leader is actually pretty good for the late game. Alright, so after looking at Vincent, we need to figure out how we are going to maneuver our followers' attack and defense by spawning out mounts. So these are the cards that are going to be our mount spawners. Alright, so looking at the Revaliant Deputy, which is a 2-cost 1/2, which summons a Dutiful Steed token, and once on each of our turns, when a mount card is put onto our field, we're able to draw and then discard a card. Alright, so as early as turn 2, you can go ahead and put out this Deputy, which will go ahead and activate his effect on his own fanfare because you're going to be putting the Dutiful Steed token onto the field immediately. You can go ahead and draw a card and then discard a card, and then, whatever card we will be discarding will be helping with the Vincent Evolve. Alright, and then next up we have Magical Gunslinger. So she's a 4-cost 3/3. You can evolve her for 1 boom. When she comes into play, you summon a Bullet Bike token, and then during our turn, when a mount card is put onto our field, we can select an enemy follower and then deal it 2 damage while drawing a card and then discarding a card. Alright, so I'm personally enjoying these Wasteland cards so far, personally, just because these cards are able to do their effects as soon as they're played, not the, when you play this card, put the card into the EX area, you gotta pay the extra cost to really do what it needs to do. No, you pay the hard cost for these cards and they're doing what they already need to do when they come out. But yeah, the Magical Gunslinger being able to put the Bullet Bike token onto the field while also being able to ping something for 2 while drawing and discarding is going to be helping with our game plan. Alright, so peeking over at the next card, we do have her Evolve, so she turns into a 4/4, but on Evolve, if there are at least 6 cards with different base costs in our cemetery, we can summon an Arcane Personal Carrier token. And then she still has that ability of during our turn when a mount card is put onto the field, an enemy follower, we choose to deal 2 damage while also drawing a card and then discarding a card. Alright, and mind you soldiers that this ability isn't once per turn, so we're actually able to proc this twice in the same turn. So being able to summon the Bullet Bite token on the regular fanfare unevolved to go ahead and deal 2 damage to something while drawing a card and discarding a card, and then evolving if we do have those 6 cards, which, might be a little bit shaky if we do have the 6 cards by the turn 4 or 5 when we are going to be playing Magical Gunslinger. But if we do have the 6, we can go ahead and do it again, deal that same follower another 2 damage with a total of 4, or if you want to take care of 2 smaller followers, you're just going to be drawing 2 and then discarding 2 that same turn. Alrighty, and lastly, we have Golem Marshal. So he's a 9-cost 5/7, and when this card is discarded, you can put a Arcane Personal Carry token into your EX area. But when he comes into play, you can select a Wasteland follower that costs 6 or less in your cemetery, summon it, and then you summon an Arcane Personal Carrier token. Alright, so we gotta love these big boss monster or just big cards that have this huge cost that really is going to be helping with this deck, because this can be one of the cards that we do discard from our hand. And then even when we do discard this card, we're going to get some sort of value, so that I really do like these cards. But getting into this follower's fanfare, so essentially you're going to be wanting to get Vincent out of the cemetery when doing this, just because your Vincent is going to be the card that has his own fanfare that's going to replace himself for whatever Wasteland card that you might already have in your deck. But getting the Arcane Personal Carrier token when playing the fanfare for the Golem Marshal is going to be very imperative, just so you can go ahead and evolve the Vincent that same turn. Alright soldiers, so if you have been keeping up with the most recent content, then you know these Wasteland cards are going to be spawning out these mounts. And if you are newer to the channel and you're interested and don't really know what these mounts do, don't worry, we are going to go over them nonetheless. So I appreciate you if you are watching and are new, so thank you so much for watching, it means a lot to me. So let's go ahead and figure out what these mounts do though. Alright, so looking at Dutiful Steed, so it's a 1-cost amulet, so you can bury this card on activate to select a follower on the field, and if it's a Wasteland follower, you can give it +1/+1. And then looking at the Bullet Bike, so it's also a 1-cost amulet, which we can also bury to select a follower on the field to give it rush, and if it's a Wasteland follower, you can give it +1 attack. And then looking at the Arcane Personal Carrier token, which is a 1-cost amulet, which we can also bury for the activate to select a follower on the field and give it ward, and if it's a Wasteland follower, you can give it +1 defense. So as you just saw, as long as there's a Wasteland follower on the field, we are going to be maneuvering anybody's attack/defense just so we can get that Vincent Evolve going. All right, soldier. So there is a new sheriff in town. So we have Mazer, the neighborhood hero. All right, so looking at Mazer, neighborhood hero. So he's a 2-cost 1/1. When he comes into play, you summon a dutiful steed token, search our deck for a rapid fire, and put it into our EX area, and then shuffle. But if we have spell chain 5, those 5 spells in cemetery, it costs 1 less to play this turn. And once on each of our turns, when we play a spell that originally cost 1 or less, we can draw a card and then discard a card. And alright, let's look at Rapid Fire. So it's a 1-cost quick spell, so we can select the following field and then deal it 2 damage. And if there are at least 3 cards named Rapid Fire in our cemetery, we can deal 3 damage instead. And if there are at least 5, we can deal 4 damage to its leader. And we can include up to 6 of this card into our deck. Alright, soldier, so if you are following along with me here, so the combo is going to be you're going to play the Mazer Neighborhood Hero, going ahead and filtering your deck for 1 by gaining the Rapid Fire, putting it into your EX area. If Mazer is still on the field, we're able to go ahead and draw a card and discard a card when we use the Rapid Fire. And then if we have the Spell Chain 5, the Rapid Fire is going to be free. My personal opinions, though, is that having the 6 Rapid Fire is going to be a little clunky, especially if we're going to be getting different card costs into our cemetery. Of course, Vincent is able to go ahead and throw a Rapid Fire into the cemetery, but having a whole bunch of Rapid Fires, and plus we only do draw once per turn, and then we do have other cards that do say, hey, when you do this, you can draw a card and discard a card. Hitting a Rapid Fire isn't going to be pretty good in terms of our draw. We kind of want to see something that might be bigger, and then something we might want to filter out of our hand that is a different cost than the rest of the other card costs that we have into our cemetery. So there's lots of elements at play when playing a whole bunch of Rapid Fires here. Alright, so speaking of filters, let's talk about the cards that are going to be helping us filter the deck out. Alright, so the first 2 cards we're going to be looking at is the Onmyoji Chain. So of course, Onmyoji has been something that's been around since set 6, which is really what they were doing in that set, was going to be filtering out a whole bunch of cards with those paper Shikigamis. So both the Demon Caller and the Curse Crafter are going to be pretty vital cards in this deck to go ahead and get some removal onto the field while also filtering your deck. Alright, and then next after those 2, we do have the Tomoe, which is a pretty good 6-cost 5/5 follower, which will turn into a 4/4 as long as we're able to discard a card. So being able to discard a card, we're able to search our deck for up to 2 spells and then add them to our hand. If you want to add Rapid Fire, by all means feel free to, but we do have another spell card that is free for this deck. Alright, and then looking at the last card, so we essentially have Heavenly Aegis for Runecraft. So Prophetess of Creation is the 10-cost 10/10. When playing this card, we're able to banish 10 cards from 1 to 10 to make this card essentially free. So she's Ward Aura, and she can't be destroyed by abilities, and it can't be destroyed by ability damage. But she does have this nice activate ability to discard this card while also drawing a card and then discarding another card. Alright, so I really do want to talk about this card because it's just amazing that you're able to play this card for free. You get a nice 10/10 body with Ward and Aura, so you can leave this upright to swing at your opponent for 10 the very next turn, but you do have to pay attention that you are going to be removing those unique base costs from your cemetery when playing this card for free, so do pay attention to that when you do go for this card. Alright, so I wanted to give some honorable mentions to some other filter cards that you really should consider when building this deck. And we can't go wrong if we use our OG Craig, so he's been around for quite a bit. I know this is a nice 2-cost card. He does kind of stink in terms of stats, but just being able to go ahead on turn 2, if you don't have the Revaliant Deputy, this is just a nice secondary card on turn 2 to being able to draw a card and discard a card. Alright, so moving on into Monica here. So this card really does do what the deck wants to do here. So being able to get this familiar out onto the field while drawing a card and discarding a card, and then having the engage to deal 3 damage to our opponent's follower, just in case they want to match our freak, is just pretty good. Alright, so let's talk about some value for the deck. Alright, so let's talk about the new card that came out. So we have this free Words of Judgment spell card. So we can select enemy following field. It loses all abilities for the rest of this turn. If there are at least 6 cards with different base costs in our cemetery, we can give a leader +2 defense. Alright, so mind you, soldiers, that Words of Judgment does not get past Aura. I know it says it loses all its abilities, but you can select a follower with Aura. But on the other side, if there's a follower that is gaining stats from a static ability, you can go ahead and lose that. They lose their stats if they lose all their abilities. It's just a blank card essentially. So the card is blank, and then if you have those 6 unique cards, of course you can heal 2, which is going to be pretty good. Alright, and then next up we have Verdict Discovery. So this is a nice quick spell that we're able to play on its opponent's turn. We're able to draw 2 cards while also getting rid of a card that we're not going to really need, or that's going to really be helping us having that unique card cost in our cemetery. And of course, if we're going to be drawing a card and discarding a card in this deck, what deck would it be if we weren't running Trail of Light? All right, so these are going to be the odd cards we're going to be putting into our deck. So I don't want to say odd cards as in, hey, you know, these cards are kind of wacky. These are the cards that are going to have the unique costs that are really big that are going to be helping when we go to pitch things. All right, so I'm not really going to talk about the other two cards here in this selection here, but the Unbodied Witch Evolve is going to be pretty decent here, just because the Unbodied Witch Evolve is able to take care of all cards on the field, that being amulets, and the fact that in set 11 we're going to be turning amulets into followers, and there isn't going to be so much amulet removal naturally in Runecraft, so having the access to having amulet removal in the Evolve is pretty good here. All right, so let's talk about the late game for this deck. Alright, so we have Mizuki Kawashima. So she's the 7 cost 7/7 from Idol Master. I don't know if you soldiers do remember, but this is going to be the card that really does help out with your game plan because she's able to engage herself to deal 3 damage to each enemy leader and enemy following the field, which is good board wipe. But if you have at least 9 cards with different base cost cards in your cemetery, then you can deal 7 damage instead. Alright, so essentially by turn 7, we should most definitely have those 9 different card costs into our cemetery to deal a total of 7 to face and 7 to the board, which is going to be absolutely amazing for the deck just so we're going to have some good, you know, board-wide removal because there isn't too much of that in this deck. And of course, next up we have Saphira Synthetic Beast. So if we are going to go for the Unbodied Witch play, this is definitely the next card we would be playing because we're drawing literally our entire deck. And then as long as we have number of Runecraft cards, or excuse me, Runecraft followers in our cemetery, which we will since we're going to be drawing our entire deck and then throwing it straight into the cemetery for the follow-up turn, Saphira is not a bad option to look at. Alright, and lastly but not least, we have Zelgania the World. So this card really does do everything. So not only is it hard removal, it also draws us a card, and it also heals us if we're at 10 or less. So this card really does do a lot. And then on top of that, we have the activate ability to banish this card from our cemetery to play the Oh Great World to our EX area, which is going to constantly ping the enemy leader for 4 while, you know, constantly pinging the enemy board for 4. So this card really does do a lot. All right, so let's talk about some tech for the deck. All right, soldiers, so this first card here I want you to pay attention to because I think this card is really fun for the deck. So we have Zodiac Demon, so the 6 cost 6/6. We can activate to engage this card, and while also discarding a follower, we can select the enemy follower on the field. We can deal X damage to it and Y to its leader. X equals the discarded follower's cost, and Y equals half the discarded follower's cost rounded up. Our reason why I put this card into the deck just because if you manage to have Kuan in your hand, you're going to be dealing 15 damage to a follower, and then you're going to be dealing 8 damage to the enemy leader, which is, you know, pretty nice, but mind you, it's kind of like a 2-card combo. And I don't think you're going to be running too much Zodiac Demons in your deck, but I do think if you do manage to hit the combo, or if it's something that you're going to be looking forward to, mind you, we are going to be filtering a whole bunch into our deck. So Zodiac Demon and Kuan isn't too crazy just because we're going to be drawing a lot, but we're not going to have a huge hand size at the same time. This is not a bad combo to be playing. Alright, and then next up we have Cilia the Condemner. So she's a 7 cost 6/6. When she comes into play, we select an enemy follow on the field and destroy it and then deal 5 damage to its leader. We can also activate by spending 2 play points and discarding this card. We can select enemy follow that costs 5 or more on the field and destroy it. Alright, so this card kind of does what the deck wants to do. So in the late game, if we want to play this card, we can go ahead and have some hard removal while burning the enemy leader for 5. But if we don't want to do that, we can go ahead and pitch this off of our other abilities, or we can just keep her in our hand for her ability itself by making sure there's a 5 or more follower that we don't have the resources to getting rid of. We can just go ahead and spend 2 getting rid of her and then taking care of that follower. Alright, and lastly we have Israfil. So of course Izzy is just not a bad choice to be putting in this deck just because this could be the 8 cost required card that we might want to put into our cemetery. Or late in the game, if we manage to see this later on and we need some board wipe and we have no other source of like removal for board wipe, we can go ahead and play Israfil, going ahead and healing ourselves for 4, and then evolving and being able to take care of the entire board. Alright, so we're getting into the grade of the deck, and if you already know how this series goes, you know we're going to take a couple look at some deck lists before we give a final grade for the deck. Alright, so this is the deck list that is on the Shadowverse Evolve website for Vincent Rune. So I don't think this deck is that bad. I do think the Great World is just a bit of a hefty purchase because the advanced card is a little expensive. I think in my build I don't have the Zelgania Great World just because I want to have a budget version just so every soldier has access to playing this, and you know, you look at this list and then you're like, all right, well let me build this, and then you see the Great World and you see how much the Great World advance costs, And, you know, Shadowverse Evolve is getting their money that way because, you know, you're just trying to put this deck together and you really do want to play it, because I know what it's like building a deck and you're not able to access every single card because you're waiting for all these cards to come in. And even like building the deck and doing some research on it, you just look at the deck and you're like, all right, well, I'm putting this into my cart at 1 by 1, and then you see like the Great World, you see how much Great World costs, and then you see how much the advanced card costs, and you're like, okay, now I see where they're getting all their money from. But yeah, all in all, the deck isn't that bad, at least for the recommended here. My one gripe would be the Great World, but of course I have a sample deck list for you all to look at, so you can not have to worry about that. All right, and then here is my personal take on the deck, or just a personal list for it. I'm sorry, this deck might seem a little unorganized, but I do want to say that I did put Sylvie in instead of Old Great World. But if you're wanting to play this deck a little more competitive, or you want to have like a lot of success, definitely go for the Great World route. It's just, this is kind of more of on a budget build. I don't think a single card in here costs more than $20. So I think the deck in total might cost less than 100, honestly, just because this deck is pretty affordable. And I think the Zodiac Demon is worth for the meme. If you manage to pitch either the Prophetess of Creation or even just like Kuon, I know it's like a 2-card combo in a 40-card deck, which is something that might not happen often. But when we have cards like Monica that's going to be filtering, I don't know why it scrolled up, but when we do have cards that are just going to be filtering our deck constantly, like the 2-card combo isn't going to be too crazy. But yeah, soldiers, I will have the deck code in the description below if you want to look at it, so please feel free to look at it if you want to. And if not, then, you know, I hope you have success in building the other version of the deck. All right, so getting back into the grade of the deck. So I will say that this deck is pretty strong. I will say it has like some strong late game. I think one of the strongest late game by just burning your opponent. And when you burn your opponent, there's just like no interaction. It just says, hey, deal this damage. And if your opponent doesn't have enough life, then that's it. Now, there is like a bit of a value trade-off here. So when we are going to be pitching cards into our cemetery, we're not going to have a way to get them back. So that really is a downside for the deck. You're going to be pitching these big cost cards that you're honestly going to want to be playing. And then when we do play these cards, and if our opponent is running the removal in terms of banishing, we do lose out on the cards being into our cemetery to have the unique cost. And I do think that's a big downside of the deck, is having the unique cost, because we're going to have a lot of duplicate, like 3 cost, 4 cost, sometimes even 5 costs in our cemetery, which can really count towards that. But getting more into the grade of things, so I'm not even going to cut it. So like, I give this deck a solid B-. This deck is kind of all over the place with what it wants to do. Now, in my terms of like enjoying Runecraft, if you want to build this deck for set 11, you're just getting into what Runecraft wants to do. I do highly recommend, I'd highly recommend building another deck. But if you do want to enjoy what Vincent does, and you enjoy Vincent, and you want to play the mages version of, hey, if you have X amount of cards into your cemetery, you want to use cards like Mizuki, then 100% go for the deck and then build it to your heart's content. But I don't recommend taking this to a BCS or a BSF. And alright, soldiers, that is it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I'm very excited to talk about the rest of these decks. I think we only have 2 more left, 3 more? Whatever the number is, but I'm ready to talk about the rest of them. We do have Seaside Memories coming out, and do look out for the video where I'm going to be explaining everything in one video. We're not going to do a breakdown for each craft. It's going to be one video to prepare for Seaside Memories, because the Seaside Memories meta isn't going to change up the meta too much. And alright, soldiers, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. It means a lot to me you are watching, and I hope you are able to have a fantastical day. And make sure you are safe in whatever you do tonight, and safe whatever you do for the rest of the year. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.
Yeah. TRINN. Just to get you away. What I got to do. What I got to do. Just to get you away. What I got to do. What I got to do.